Hey everyone, welcome to today's Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here because today we're looking at a topic that fundamentally questions the actual fabric of the internet as we know it. Think for a second about how much we pour into our digital presence, right? We invest hours, money, our very identities into these platforms. Yet, the foundational layer of all that digital real estate, the actual naming directory, is essentially just leased out from under us. So today, we're diving into this really fascinating research and development initiative from a company called LINKSPREED LLC. Their main focus? Reclaiming that foundational digital real estate from centralized control and exploring what they're calling the rise of decentralized free FTLDs. If you've ever wondered who really controls the internet directory and how peer-to-peer technology might just completely upend that whole structure, well, you're in exactly the right place. Okay, let's dive into this. Do you actually own your website, or are you just renting it? Because in today's Web 2 landscape, the reality outlined in our source material is that users don't truly own their digital identities. Sure, you might pay for your domain name every single year, but you're effectively just leasing space from a massive digital landlord. And what's really interesting is that even in the Web 3 space, which promised us all this decentralization, we're seeing a very similar problem. A lot of blockchain-based crypto domains still heavily rely on standard centralized Web 2 gateways and traditional DNS just to resolve in an everyday browser. Basically, your digital real estate is still governed by centralized systems, which means true sovereign ownership remains totally elusive. But today, we're going to explore how an emerging Web 4 architecture is proposing to shift this dynamic entirely. So here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with number 1, the rented internet monopoly, then 2, the FreeTLDs revolution, 3, LNS, infinite domain freedom, moving on to 4, HELION, routing the Web 4 layer, and finally 5, the user-owned digital frontier. All right, let's get into it. Section 1, the rented internet monopoly. So for decades, the global internet has relied on a single centralized gatekeeper. We're talking about ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. Our source material points out that literally every single .com, .org, and country code domain you type into your browser only exists because of this one centralized hierarchy. ICANN essentially governs the entire directory of the World Wide Web. Now, to be fair, it's important to understand why this system was built in the first place, right? Back in the early days of Web 1.0 and 2.0, a centralized directory was an absolute necessity just for efficiency and, to prevent double naming. You couldn't have two identical .coms pointing to different servers without total chaos. But as the web scaled up, that vital utility kind of transformed into a massive hierarchical choke point. When we talk about a centralized internet, this right here is the foundational layer. And when centralized domain systems act as gatekeepers, your digital property is frankly never fully secure from outside influence. To really grasp this lack of absolute digital sovereignty, just imagine a thriving global business built entirely on a .io or a .com domain. Out of nowhere, the centralized registry decides to, say, quadruple the renewal fees. Or maybe a regulatory body decides the site's content violates some newly drafted policy and they just revoke the domain right at the registrar level. Boom. The business vanishes overnight from the standard web. The infrastructure itself is inherently vulnerable to censorship because the technical off switch physically exists in a centralized location. You're basically always playing in someone else's sandbox, entirely under their rules. Moving on to Section 2, the FreeTLDs revolution. And this brilliantly illustrates the guiding vision behind the FreeTLDs program, which is simply this: the internet of tomorrow will not be built on rented land. This represents a massive philosophical pivot away from the rented spaces of Web 2 toward a proposed era of absolute Web 4 ownership. The whole goal of this initiative is to prove that an alternative, fully decentralized root directory isn't just some theoretical pipe dream, but an active necessity for the future of the web. Just think about what rented land actually costs developers and creators today. It's not just those annual registration fees, it's the structural friction, the compliance costs, and the constant overhead of building on leased infrastructure. This initiative aims to just remove those barriers permanently. So let's contrast these two. On one side of the spectrum, we have the traditional ICANN model. This requires strict reliance on a central authority to approve and distribute a very limited set of top-level domains. Plus, it requires massive server farms just to maintain the registry. On the flip side, we have LINKSPREED's proposed FreeTLDs. This model envisions a future where literally anyone can create their own TLDs and register domains for free. Now, you might be wondering, how on earth is zero-cost infrastructure actually achieved? Well, instead of massive centralized server farms that bleed money to maintain, a decentralized directory distributes the ledger across the users themselves. Because it's a peer-to-peer network, every single node shares a tiny fraction of the load, which effectively drops the centralized overhead to zero. It's a complete paradigm shift from an exclusive permission-based system to a completely open, decentralized one. Which brings us to Section 3, LNS, Infinite Domain Freedom. So the actual technology powering these FreeTLDs is LNS, which stands for the Linkspreed Name Service. In the source material, it's very appropriately referred to as the infinite name service. And instead of relying on the standard web protocols we use every day, LNS utilizes a peer-to-peer protocol called Web4, : For those of you wondering about the underlying architecture here, standard HTTP points to a location, right? Like a specific server. IPFS points to content, like a specific file hash. But the Web4 protocol aims to go even further. It builds a native peer-to-peer directory protocol that deeply integrates both identity and routing. This allows the whole system to just completely bypass central servers and those clunky legacy structures.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the shift from a rigid phone book to a fluid network. The traditional domain name system, or DNS, acts as a highly centralized directory. You type in a URL and your computer queries a central server to look up the IP address. But that creates massive vulnerabilities. We're talking DNS cache poisoning, or those devastating DDoS attacks where overwhelming traffic just completely crashes the central lookup servers. LNS, on the other hand, uses the Web4 protocol to create a peer-to-peer lookup system. And because there's no single central server, there is literally no single point of failure to DDoS, and absolutely no central phone book for anyone to control, alter, or censor.
The tangible freedoms this LNS system creates are absolutely significant. For starters, traditional extension restrictions just completely disappear. Users can create entirely custom TLDs that perfectly match their specific name, their brand, or their community. And yes, get this, you can finally register that coveted domain ending in a coffee cup emoji or yourbrand.rocketship because the protocol natively supports emoji-based TLDs. How cool is that? But structurally, the most important feature we need to talk about here is the Universal Digital Identity, or UID. This is not just a username. A UID physically binds the domain to cryptographic keys that you hold personally. So your identity actually traverses the web with you, universally authenticated without any middleman whatsoever. It takes the domain from being a rented lease and transforms it into a permanent, uncensorable cryptographic anchor that belongs solely to you. All right, Section 4, HELION, routing the Web4 layer. Now, a decentralized directory is brilliant. But let's be real, if anyone can create any domain instantly, how does the network actually know where to send your data? You're going to need some incredible technical plumbing for that. Enter HELION. The source defines HELION as the critical routing engine governing the fourth layer of the Web4 protocol stack. To put that into perspective, if Layer 1 is the physical network, Layer 2 is the ledger or consensus mechanism, and Layer 3 holds the specific storage protocols, then Layer 4 acts as the dynamic routing engine. It's essentially the traffic cop of a totally serverless internet. In a network where there is absolutely no central ICANN server to look up addresses, HELION acts as the dynamic manager, specifically designed to solve that massive peer-to-peer routing challenge. Let's move to and see how this builds as a dynamic journey of a data packet. First, imagine typing in a custom Web4 URL, utilizing one of these new FreeTLDs. Instantly, HELION kicks in. Instead of querying a traditional DNS root server, HELION dynamically maps the peer-to-peer network, calculating the absolutely most efficient and secure pathway available. Thanks to this dynamic management, the data packets securely find their exact destination, routing directly to the specific node hosting that data. And honestly, the best part? This all happens without the data ever needing to cross paths with standard ISP choke points or centralized DNS systems. It's a completely parallel, totally self-sustaining routing environment. And that brings us to our final section, Section 5, the user-owned digital frontier. So the crucial point is that this establishes a true farm and spend community economy. You see, LINKSPREED's R&D focus isn't just about handing people novel website extensions. By backing decentralized domains with the robust routing power of HELION, Web4 creates an entirely self-sustaining ecosystem. In this farm and spend economy, users actually contribute their own idle computational power and bandwidth, that's the farming aspect of it, to power the HELION routing and LNS directories. And in return, they earn native value that they can then spend right back within that very same ecosystem. It literally shifts the power directly from a centralized monopoly down to the individual node operators. In this proposed ecosystem, absolute data sovereignty isn't just some premium feature you pay extra for. It's the fundamental baseline default of the entire network. We've covered a lot of ground today, transitioning from the rigid hierarchy of traditional centralized directories all the way to the infinite peer-to-peer possibilities of Web4 protocols, UID cryptographic anchors, and HELION routing. The Internet of Tomorrow, at least as envisioned by this research, is free, it's infinite, and it's entirely user-owned. So I'll leave you with this question. When absolute data sovereignty becomes the default and there are literally no gatekeepers left to tell you what you can or cannot register, What will you build on your own digital frontier? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring.